So good morning. It's Friday and the room is still packed. The conference has been amazing. Fred, congratulations. It's really been a learning experience, I'm sure, for all of us. I'm honored to be here. As Fred said, I'm Gina Burkhart, the CEO of Jobs for the Future. Many of you know us. For those of you who don't, our work is all about building and supporting academic and career pathways for youth and adults. And we're particularly focused on those most disadvantaged by life circumstances and hoping to have everyone reach a place of economic mobility and career success, attaining education at the level they want and deserve. So I'm thrilled to be in this new position, and I have to say, many of you may believe this about your team, but I actually do have the best team in the world. So. And I have the best panel. So, 3 women, 4 women on stage. How's that for a different flavor at a conference?
Only in workforce development.
And as I introduced briefly the panel, their bios are in the book, but I want to say that each one of them brings with them not just their current experience, but actually knowledge of the field and what they're talking about. So they have practical knowledge and application that they're now bringing to a new role or new roles and making a real difference. So Crystal Bridgman, go Tar Heels.
That's right.
I won.
Absolutely. Even better.
All right. So Crystal is the Senior Director of Workforce Development Programs for the Siemens Foundation and has worked with both Senator Harkin and Senator Murray and has much experience working with programs that serve non-traditional undergraduate students in both North Carolina and in Georgia. So welcome, Crystal. Abby Carlton, Abigail. Abby is okay?
Fine.
Abby is the Associate Director for Secure Livelihoods at the Rockefeller Foundation. She also worked in some of New York City's most underserved communities, so she brings with her a wealth of information about that. And then Allison Gerber, whose position is officially Senior Associate for Annie E. Casey's Foundation Center for Community and Economic Opportunity. But before coming to Annie E. Casey, she was the Executive Director of the District of Columbia's Workforce Investment Council and a Senior Associate with the Workforce Investment Council there. So again, all of them speak from experience and knowledge. We're going to ask them first to talk a little bit about the work. I'm sure many of you have over the last few days heard lots of information, seen lots of examples of what's happening for our adult workforce. This panel is focused on what some of the organizations are doing to help youth come into employment and careers that actually lead them to self-sustaining wages and career success. I actually heard in a conversation just the other day that it is a difficult place to get employers to think about hiring youth who are not experienced and don't have degrees. I don't agree with that. I'm hoping the panel doesn't agree with that and will help us understand what kind of programs are now in place and are really working to bring youth who are out of the system back into the system, youth who have been disadvantaged by life circumstances into a place where they again have hope and potential and possibility. Why don't we start with Allison, and then we'll go to Abby, and then Crystal, you can talk a little bit about the employer side of it.
Great, well, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I just want to talk a little bit about what Casey's doing and why. It really sits for Casey Youth and Young Adult Employment really at the core of both our mission and values, as well as what we feel is our competencies across the foundation. So not to bring up ancient history, and I think a lot of people in this room are aware of this, but for those of you who aren't, Casey was an early investor in the industry partnership strategy. It really came out of the last time we did a big jobs initiative, investing in sites across the country, and we asked them to do different jobs projects and test different approaches. And and kind of support and learn with them along the way. And lo and behold, the approach that they tested and that we learned from and that was particularly effective was industry partnerships. So coming out of that initiative, we started to invest with others in the National Fund and the scaling and the tremendous work that all of you are currently doing. And it's really that kind of impact that we're looking to see when we turn to youth and young adult employment. We'd love to be sitting in a room like this in 10 or 15 years and really see a sea change in practice about how we think about connecting young people to employment. And that's for Casey, a lot of it is it's twofold. It's one, because we are really at heart a Children and Families Foundation. We care deeply about young people, particularly young people who are system involved in the juvenile justice system and child welfare. But it's also because we really, as we come out of this Great Recession, the generation that we're, the one group that seems not to be gaining ground as we see these numbers change every month, as we've gone to 5.5, 5.4 unemployment, you're not seeing the same thing for young people. And as we think about where we need to be going and what we need to be doing, that's really, we think the opportunity moment in this country is to bring what we've learned across both this demand side type of opportunity and our deep investment in young people and especially young people with less access to economic opportunity, and bridge those. And so I can talk about, as we get into it a little further, how we hope to go about that in the next 10 years. And that's what it will be for us, a sort of 10-year investment as a kickoff, probably longer, but that's kind of the frame for why we want to do this work.
Great. Abby?
Sure. So I, as Gina said, I'm a program officer at the Rockefeller Foundation, and we are a 102-year-old foundation whose mission is to improve the well-being of humanity throughout the world. So that keeps us pretty busy. Our work focuses in four primary areas: health, the environment, urbanization, and employment. And we do our work a little bit differently than some other foundations. We do most of our grant making through time-bound initiatives that go through a couple of different stages of maturity. So there's an early, short research and landscaping phase. There's a middle phase of any given initiative that's really focused on testing and experimentation around strategies that seem to be gaining traction in a particular area. And then if we get the go-ahead from our Board of Trustees to go into that final phase, that's when the foundation will really make a signature commitment of financial and human resources to an issue for 5 up to maybe 10 years. And when we, in our employment work, made the decision to focus on young people, we did that for the reasons that Allison describes, of just looking at unemployment, underemployment in the labor market. But also, we were really compelled by the research that shows that if young people fail to gain that early foothold in the labor market, it can have such profound and enduring consequences for their career trajectories, family stability, financial security, all of the things that folks here know so well. So when we then jumped into that space about 2 years ago now, I should have said, we in that arc that I shared about our initiatives are sort of near the end of the middle phase. So I've been really focused on testing and experimentation over the last 2 years. When we jumped in, we did so very deliberately with a focus on employers, a focus on the demand side of the equation for 2 primary reasons. One is because when we looked at the landscape of what had been tried in the past, the preponderance of work was more in the area of education and training. So we thought if we start with employers and try to understand better what is driving employers to hire young people, what is standing between employers and hiring more young people, what are the different types of solutions that might unlock? And then the other primary reason is because we believe that it has to be about more than changing who sits in the seats, but that we need more seats, we need more jobs and more opportunities in this country, and especially given the current policy climate, we're better to start than with employers. So that's a little bit of what brought us into that this space. We have focused in our grant making over the last 2 years in sort of 3 strategies. So I'll just share them briefly, and then I'm happy to give some examples as the conversation goes on. One is to try to surface and test different innovations that are trying to get at key barriers in the employment system. So some work there around new forms of talent assessments and service delivery models around on-the-job supports. Another is to support efforts that are employer-facing, employer engagement efforts that are shown or trying to improve employment opportunities, increase employment opportunities for young people. So that's the context in which we've had the opportunity to partner with the National Fund on the Youth Industry Partnership Initiative that I think folks have heard about over the course of the last couple of days. And then the last area has been to try to raise the profile of this issue among employers and partner directly with employers to surface different strategies that they might then try in their businesses. And so one partner for us in that has been Starbucks, and many of you may have heard of their Leaders Up effort, which is a nonprofit that they spun off to look at increasing employment opportunities for young people across their supply chain. So they have a supply chain of north of 15,000 suppliers and look at the possibilities that might exist there.
Great. So I thought I would start just by sharing a little bit with you about the Siemens Foundation in general. The foundation was started in 1998. It is very focused on the mission of STEM and increasing awareness around STEM education and really igniting the next generation of STEM leaders. Traditionally, we've been very focused on kind of the early childhood awareness part of that, and then also providing opportunity to the best and the brightest among our high school students to advance in STEM degrees to really fill those high credential STEM jobs. So the programs that have really been the signature for the foundation for the past 15 years or so have been two. The Siemens competition has been really the hallmark of the foundation. It's one of the nation's premier high school research competition in STEM. And the goal of that program is really to advance the best and the brightest research as well as students to become our next generation of leaders. The second program is called Siemens Science Days, and it's really about opening awareness for young students as well as engaging our employees in part of the process. As you might imagine, Siemens has a lot of expertise and leadership across its different business divisions, and it's really an opportunity to engage that leadership with the next generation of STEM leaders. So that program brings them in to do hands-on demonstrations, kind of the fun part of STEM, and also provides a lot of online resources for teachers. And so there's an online platform that's available to them 24 hours a day, and that's aligned with national standards in terms of NGSS. And so we know what works for science and for STEM for our students. But in 2014, our board decided they really wanted to expand the focus of the foundation to include workforce development. So we're a little bit of the new kid on the block compared to some of our colleagues up here. Of course, Siemens, the company, is not new to this area. Many of you probably know us through our corporate work, but the foundation really had not yet invested in that philanthropic point of view. And so we really started to think about what's the right role for us in starting a new program and launching a new program. And when we thought about that, I think one of the reasons why we've decided to invest in young adults is because it makes sense for who we are as a foundation. We have been historically focused on youth, and this is really a natural extension of that. And also, in looking at the research, a lot of what you've heard my colleagues here say, it's absolutely a critical need in our country. When we look at those youth employment rates, we look at recent reports on how our millennials' skills compare to international peers. And then when we look at the numbers in just terms of disconnected youth in this country, we clearly have an issue and an opportunity with this generation that we think that we can bring some expertise and learning from the Siemens experience through our work in the foundation. And so, how we're going to go about do that, as we're getting started, we're really looking at two key strategies to focus on this population. We're looking at STEM middle skill overall. How do we really advance those opportunities for young adults in STEM that require less than a 4-year degree, but definitely require a post-secondary credential of value? And we're doing that in two key ways. One, we really want to help change the perception of middle skill opportunity in this country. We want it to rebrand it in a way that it becomes a career pathway of choice and not a second choice in this country, especially when we look at the numbers. You know, we were very intrigued by the research that Brookings put out a few years ago around these opportunities and the hidden STEM economy. And when we look at the numbers that 50% of STEM jobs require less than a 4-year degree and pay on average more than $53,000, that's not bad. Those are good numbers. And yet, we don't have a systematic investment happening directly in STEM middle skill. Typically, federal investments in STEM happen at the high credential level, which is great. We have needs there too. But we saw this as a real opportunity to bring the Siemens brand to bear. And so we're really focused on that aspect of it. And then the second aspect is really identifying those effective models that work, and then how do we scale them? You know, we know a lot in this field, we know a lot in middle skill, we know a lot in STEM. So how do we learn what's working and then really bring that to scale? And that's where we're going to target our efforts over the next 2 to 3 years as we get the program off the ground. And I'm happy to talk further about some of those specific projects and interventions we're doing.
Great. Allison, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're investing in and why, and if you're seeing any early results.
Okay. So, you know, I've been at Casey about 20 months now, and I came sort of partway into a set of investments that, you know, both in the portfolio I lead as well as across the foundation that we've been gleaning learnings from. So one set of investments has been, you know, in the fund and in demand-driven strategies, and we've been seeking to, through some of the youth work that you're seeing, figure out, you know, does this approach work for young people? We've also been investing in some of the multiple pathways, the Back on Track work that JFF does, both, you know, through the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund at Aspen and understanding how that connects young people in different communities to opportunity, but as well deeply in our Jim Casey work, which works with kids who are in the child welfare system, and so understanding opportunities for those who are really most at risk. And I would just say broadly, and this is, you know, a gross generalization, so people can kind of pick it apart, but I think what we feel is that in the Back on Track work, there a lot of success at really connecting young people both to secondary and post-secondary opportunities, less directly connected to employers, less like clear articulation to those job opportunities in the market and careers. And that's, you know, what the young people that we're really interested, they need that full connection. They need, you know, they need to work and they need to be earning wages, and many of them need to be earning wages that support a family. You know, through the work with the fund, as well as some other investments that we've made in sector-specific strategies for youth, I think we've seen that, you know, young people 18 and up can be served through an industry partnership, that they can be connected to work, employers are involved. But quite frankly, the strategies work better for those young people who probably have a high school credential or are more directly poised to kind of enter a more mature or adult-oriented program. So for those young people who are like our Jim Casey youth, who maybe are a little more instability in their life, need additional wraparound supports. There's not that what we call positive youth development component, that thing that's really focused on how do we help young people, you know, fully mature. You know, their brains aren't fully mature until the age of 25, and you know, that's not always something that's built into these industry partnerships, is thinking about those positive youth development, those maturation points. And so we're sort of interested in where is the space that we can bring those things together, that demand-driven approach and that positive youth development. And I think we would say that we have seen it at the program level. So in any given community, something really great that works, I like to say 60 kids maybe a year, but in reality in most of those communities there's probably 10,000 kids who need that type of opportunity. And so that's the problem that we're starting to look at. And when I said we'll be investing for, you know, 10 years, we're going to be looking for 4 sites who already have that program, or even a couple programs that are serving a small number of young people, and say, what would it take in this community to infuse these principles, not just in a program, but in institutions? And maybe that means in our career and technical education program, maybe that means in our community colleges, and our public workforce system, and a lot of the different places that young people, and we consider young people 18 to 29, are currently, you know, going to get connected to work, and to say, we think that's what they're going to need, regardless of what door they walk into, those 2 components, and we need it to be more than in one program that serves 60 kids. We need it to be in every door that they walk in.
Are there specific programs that you know of that actually help with the maturity side of things inside the workplace? I mean, I've heard, especially from the person at Starbucks, that sometimes once these young adults get into the workplace, they're struggling with actually navigating relationships, supervision, things like that. Do you know, are there practices that you know of, or successful practices that?
Yeah, so we've seen a couple different things, and a lot of it kind of depends on where you're starting on the developmental spectrum. So just to throw out a couple things that we like, I think we're big fans of Our Piece of the Pie in Hartford, Connecticut, the CBO that really provides a lot of those wraparound and has a positive youth development approach, but it also creates that on-ramp to the manufacturing program at Assinuntuck Community College, and that is directly connected to employers and their industry partnership. Love that, and I love that, depending on where a young person might start, that Our Piece of the Pie has a number of different things that they can connect them to. I also think, I think what Starbucks is doing is tremendous in providing college opportunities for their baristas, but I also think we need like on-ramps to the barista program. And I think we saw a reconnection center in Tacoma where young people who may be homeless, who don't have childcare but have children that they need to bring with them, can just come wherever they are, and they have an opportunity in this reconnection center to get a variety of different supports, maybe wash their clothes, take a nap, have somebody watch their kid for them, but then they also can, there's a barista training program there, and so that they can get on that on-ramp to that opportunity that would start to provide them a pathway. And so those are really diverse examples, but I think they give a sense of what we're seeing.
Right. Abby, you want to talk a little bit about what you're learning from your programs?
Sure, and just to add to that, I mean, I think one of the things that we've learned from the Youth Industry Partnership Initiative is that young people do need, in some cases, different types of supports or more intensive supports once they are on the job than maybe some of their adult peers. And I think there's this sort of tricky dynamic between some life challenges around, let's say, lack of access to childcare or transportation or housing instability, and when we talk about sort of soft skills and professional skills, and I think sometimes almost a conflation of one and the other. So I think we need to, there's a lot of work to be done to sort of tease that out, and one of the efforts or a strand of work that we've been really interested in is some of these new, or even not so new, but some service delivery models that are trying to connect support service provision directly to employers. So an example of this that some folks may know, the Work-Life Partnership out of Denver, where they connect with employers, provide a fee-for-service model that employers pay for, that then allows employees of those companies to have access to navigators who can connect them to local resources and supports that they might need as problems arise, so they are hopefully more likely to be able to not only get into that job, which is part of what we're all trying to do, but then be successful on the job. And that model is not specifically focused on young people, but one of the things we're now working with WorkLife to test is to better understand what are the types of services that young people specifically are connecting to through that type of offering, and see if we can kind of push the conversation, particularly around those types of support services, and maybe disconnect it a bit from the soft skills conversation. So just something I wanted to add there. But I guess, two big areas of, I guess it would be a combination of maybe lessons learned, challenges, and successes that we've had in the work. I mentioned that we've worked a lot directly with employers. At this point, we've spoken with, in different capacities, hundreds of employers. And it has been very heartening to see that there is no lack of interest in this issue, and it comes from a lot of different places. Some employers who are really concerned about growing their talent pipelines, others who are shifting to a more tech-intensive strategy and want to bring more young people in that capacity, others who are trying to better cater to a younger client base. And just an example of that, we partnered with the Small Business Majority, and one of the things that we wanted to see was if they could go out and among their members get 100 employer members to sign up to hire, train, or mentor opportunity youth, disconnected youth. And in I can't remember, I think it was 6 months, we said, like, can they get 100 employers to sign up in 6 months? And in fewer than that, over 150 employers had signed up to this. So that is very exciting. Where I think the challenge lies is that there is still a pretty big gulf between that interest and being able to, in a given company, implement a youth employment strategy that works for the business, that in which the young people can be successful. And so that is an area where we're focusing a lot of attention. What is the path between an employer raising their hand and actually being able to implement something on the ground? I was just listening to the stories yesterday of the young adult employer champions, and it is hard work. I have nothing but respect for those who have done that in their companies. And I think what we need to do is to collect those stories at as granular a level as we can, to say, it meant talking to this person and bringing in these people and partnering with this organization, to be able to sort of pair that interest with a broader menu of strategies that employers can try, and think about the types of supports, technical assistance, consulting supports, new tools that will help them implement those strategies.
How as a foundation do you have your voice, not just your money, be heard in these kinds of learnings out in the field? So you're learning a lot, and how are you engaging actually with employers to make sure they get this information, that you help bring some of the best practices to the field?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've been doing, and this is an area where I think our learning is pointing us to doing even more of this. So we have started down that path. One of the things I mentioned, the small business majority example, one of the things that we've done as a follow-on to that is to support in a couple of communities across the country employer sort of intermediary organizations that are now trying to spread some of these best practices by providing technical assistance, working with other small businesses in those communities to help them if they're interested in that model specifically, but also start to understand what are some of the best practices there. So that's been a piece. We've also we've partnered with an effort that folks may be aware of called Grads of Life, which is trying to, again, bring together some of those best practices. And like I said, I think where that work is both exciting but needs to be pushed on is what can we do as a foundation to support efforts to actually try to implement those solutions and monitor them, so that we can tell the story that we all feel like we need to better tell about the business benefit of some of these strategies.
Thank you. So Crystal, you're just starting out, and there's a lot of information and programs and best practices that you, I'm sure, are considering. How are you going to move the work forward in the foundation, and how are you going to evaluate as you go along whether it's working or not?
I think those were some two important key questions for us when we were developing this program, because there's clearly a lot of work going on in this area. I think one of the most exciting things about the time we live in is that everyone's talking about workforce development. 10 or 15 years ago, that was not the case. People kind of thought, well, what does that mean? What are we talking about? And so we were very intentional about thinking, what is that target that we can look at where we can have an impact, and how we can just really narrowly focus our energy and efforts. We didn't want to duplicate things that were going on. We want to partner where we can, in terms of either resources or thought partnership. But that's really what helped us focus on those two areas I mentioned. One, really thinking about how do we change the perception on these career opportunities, particularly for young adults and for decision makers in their lives, whether that's parents, career counselors, or just other people who have influence on them. And then two, identifying these effective models and scaling them up. And really in that area, a place that I think we could have a particular ability to leverage some expertise and experience is around work-based learning models. We really think that they are an effective model in many cases, but very underutilized. So we wanted to think about how do we understand what works across these different types of models, whether it's an apprenticeship or an internship or, or a co-op experience, and then why do they work? And think about, how can you learn what those principles are in a way that either a company or a state, regardless of the level of their resources, could implement those key principles in a way that they know that would lead to something that was effective for their young adult population. So that's an area, because of our experience in trying to get apprenticeships off the ground here, our experience with community college partnerships and our experience with high school partnerships as a company, the company's experienced that firsthand, what those challenges have been. We really have a lack of infrastructure in this country for work-based learning, and they had the experience where they were kind of starting over every time. And we've had a lot of good outcomes. We've had some challenges along the way, but we think that that's a place where we know it works. You engage young people quickly with the employer. You build that network and that relationship, both to the academic piece and the learning piece, but you're also building a positive work history, and you're getting some experience under the belt, but it's hard to do. We really just don't have an infrastructure in the U.S. for that. So we're very intentional in focusing on those two areas. And to do that, we're really working with two national nonprofits to get started who are going to help us really target our energy in both changing the perception and rebranding, and then also identifying what works in work-based learning.
Great. So Allison, you bring real practical knowledge and experience, probably good and bad, right?
A lot more about what not to do than what to do.
And I think that's really important. So as you think about the goals for the work that you're doing and the investments that you're making, what do you bring from your past experience that says, don't do this, or here's the place we ought to go? And congratulations for actually having practical application in the mix, right?
So I think there's a couple different ways I could answer that question, and maybe I'll just I'll riff a little bit. So I think, my last job, I was a WIB director in the district. And I'm pretty sure that's for being a WIB director and not for working in the district, but thanks, Michael. And a lot of our challenges in the district, we're a place where the youth programming really is the tail that wags the dog. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't really a youth person before that. I was really more of an adult, sort of demand-driven sector kind of person. And I think my biggest takeaway from that was around all the challenges we had. The underlying problem that we could not solve was really around culture, mm-hmm. right? It was really around what is the culture for being a high-performing organization, for being a high-performing system. And I think that's a lot of when we think about the 4 places that we'll look to invest. And in fact, when I was talking to our board yesterday about this work, it ultimately comes down to the places that we think we can go from programming to having institutions and systems and practices that are very different are the places where there is a culture, where there's leadership, where there's use of data, where there's things that are already infused that really allow folks to go further faster. When I was in district government, I asked one of the business school professors at Georgetown, what does it take to kind of create cultural change within an institution, thinking about my own sort of challenges. And he said that the B school case studies are pretty clear on this, that it's almost impossible. They don't know what makes a good organization good and what makes a bad organization bad, but once culturally you've gone bad, it's very hard to go good. Mm-hmm. And so in talking to our board members who are mostly UPS folks yesterday, we were talking about some of the businesses, and I won't name any of them because that might get some of them in trouble, but where you can see where this has happened, right? UPS is an organization that has a good culture. Casey is an organization that has a good culture. When I was at Aspen, that was an organization with a strong culture. It just was. And so I think some of where we need to start is where there are things that are happening that are really positive and where there are those markers of cultural success, and say, how can we use this to lift up and to start to do more of it, and then change a little bit that narrative that we have in the youth employment space, which is nothing works. Employers don't want to hire kids. They're not as competitive as other folks. They don't look like you think they're going to look, or they don't, and not start on that deficit side of the equation, but start with folks who are working, on the other side of the equation. And
Great.
Go from there.
Thank you. Really good. Abby, in 3 years, what's success look like?
That's a great question. Hopefully my board will agree with my answer. I I think in 3 years, I mean, I hope that we are in a place where that, you know, and I really appreciate what you were saying, Allison, and I think that, you know, when we go out there, we are trying to sort of think about, you know, what are the business reasons why employers would want to hire more young people, and start from that sort of that side of the conversation. And I hope that we see in 3 years more, just a sort of more examples that we can all point to of employers who have, not as part of a corporate social responsibility initiative, although I think that that's a great starting point, but as part of their core business, found ways to implement strategies that are starting to show success, that are more inclusive of young people, and that we're doing a good job of telling those stories, catalyzing business-to-business conversations about what's working. Ultimately, I think there's a role for foundations to play, and there's a role that we shouldn't be playing in this space. And for these approaches to really take off, I think it has to be businesses talking to each other about what works. I hope that in 3 years there are more resources that employers who are looking to try something can turn to, so that they can figure out how to test, how to measure within their companies. I hope that we know a bit more about what it takes to sort of successfully support young people as part of those strategies, kind of in the vein I was talking about before. And I think that young people are seen more as that untapped talent pool that I think many of us in the room think that they are, and that there are ways to identify that talent. So I mentioned before, we're thinking a lot about new forms of talent assessments. You hear a lot in talking to employers that they don't feel like they're making great matches to roles at higher skill levels, at lower skill levels. I think we see some really interesting new approaches that are trying to do a better job of that. Mostly, I would say, in the higher skilled roles at this point, but can we take some of those new tools and try to point them at young people and see what types of opportunities that might open up? And I know, you know, folks are probably familiar with the sort of the skills-based hiring work that Innovate Educate has done. I think that's tremendous work, and we should keep pushing on things like that. There's also a lot of sort of burgeoning field of for-profit talent assessment companies that see business in this, and where are there opportunities for us to partner there, because that's where employers are going to make some of those matches. So those are a couple of the things that I hope we see more of in the landscape.
Great. Okay, get your questions ready. I have one more question for Crystal, and then we'll come out to the participants. So Crystal, where does the education system fit into your thinking around developing this work?
You know, I think one of the key areas for us in terms of a learning that we're looking for over the next several years is if we're able to really identify what are those key principles that make work-based learning work. We'd love to see, especially at a state level and a regional level, because we think that's where the change has to happen, especially in education in this country. We'd love to see those principles be embedded so that we have more of a systemic change, not just boutique programs popping up across the country, and then be able to look at the impact of those systems change. And we'd love to see a pathway continuing from an education through a workforce, or through a post-secondary and a workforce system in a state, to really understand that impact. So I think that in addition to, for us seeing some programs and states achieve success, we really want to see that systemic change throughout an education system. That's going to take longer than 3 years, so we will just be able to get started a little bit in that discussion, but we'd love to eventually get to a point where it's not kind of an exception to the rule, that you're talking about work-based learning as part of an education experience for every young person, that it's part of a typical experience for them.
Great. Siemens is a great example, so thank you. It's a company that's actually modeling well for others. Questions from the audience? It's really hard to see.
It is hard.
It's like, oh, maybe we get to go home.
I don't know where the mics are. Here comes Jake. Jake's got there's two questions right up here, Jake. Or right there, go ahead.
Hi, so
Say who you are.
I'm Matt Bruce from Chicago. So when we talk about young adult pathways to employment and getting beyond that first job, and we're trying to shy away from alternative pathways or non-traditional pathways, start calling them progressive pathways to college and career, realizing that students have to go back and forth between full-time employment and also education that then stacks and builds towards college. But one of the struggles we have is that looking at the education training sort of market for those progressive pathways, it's just a chaotic, hot mess of sub-degree credentials and licenses. Some of them are validated by a third party. Some of them have varying degrees of industry recognition or industry value. And so it's difficult to put young adults or help young adults find those pathways when it's still so unclear about how those things are really working and developing. So my question is, have you seen any region or city that's doing a good job sort of curating that chaotic market and helping young adults access those pathways through explaining it and making it clear for them?
I mean, so I'll just be blunt. I haven't seen anything at the citywide level. I think that's part of what we would be hoping to see at the end of a multi-year investment. We're seeing things more at the sort of individual, one occupation type of pathway, right? And I think part of the subtext of what you're saying is that we'll need to turn money away from the bad stuff to do more of the good stuff. And that's part of the hard work that'll have to happen in cities, and that's part of what you'll need sort of business, I think, leadership to help catalyze is around that turning away from and turning towards. But I really agree with what you said, Matt, about the not alternative pathways. We talk about it at Casey as multiple pathways. Mm-hmm. There's lots of different ways to get there. We think increasingly young people need all of those different options for very different reasons, and that if we kind of embrace that, not just for one set of kids who are particularly low income or look or act a certain way, but for all kids, that I think, the nature of post-secondary education and experience is really changing in this country, and we need kids to have multiple kinds of experiences, both at work and in school over time, to be successful, and that's every kid, right?
I would just add to that. I think that's absolutely why it's critical to have employers involved in the conversation, especially if there's a connection to a career or job, because they can help voice that. I mean, we've had an experience with that around our mechatronics credential, because Siemens is an industry leader in that area. It's been easy for us to go around and have conversations with educators about the key elements that need to be in their program to meet that mechatronics standard. And that's an international standard, but you're right. I mean, there's a mixed bag out there when it comes to credentials. I think that there's a key role for business associations. I think the work that's happening, and I'm going to get their name wrong, but through the National Association of Business and Industry Associations, where they're really trying to look at this issue and identify the skills and credentials that matter. And they are also doing it by occupation, I believe, in industry, not necessarily at a state or regional level. I think those are key discussions, and I know that there's a lot of these discussions happening also through, like, the credential discussions happening through Lumina. So I think there's a lot of people who are trying to figure this out, but you're right, I think it's a mess right now, and that's why it's critical to have employers or trade associations for an industry involved in your discussions and efforts.
A hot mess, right, Matt?
Hot mess.
Another question? Katie? And
Ariane,
then there's a question up here too, if you want to bring the mic up here after.
thank you.
Right here.
Ariane Hegovish, Institute for Women's Policy Research. It's a great panel. We work on creating better opportunities for women to access high-paying occupations, and middle-skilled jobs are incredibly gender segregated, particularly the ones in STEM and healthcare. So I was just wondering how far opening jobs to the other gender is part of the agenda, whether you've got any good examples of where this is happening, whether it's on your horizon, and you know, or I should also say we are doing a project at the moment to look more systematically at socioeconomic supports for women and how they help them complete training programs. So if anybody has information, that would also be welcome.
Great.
I would say, you know, it's absolutely one of the areas that we're very focused on and aware of, and definitely one of the issues we'll look at in developing our programs. I think that's one of the reasons we believe that if we're able to effectively profile students and graduates, particularly women who've been successful in STEM middle skill, have them tell their own story to their generation, we think that will be a really effective tool. And we've seen it in action a little bit on our corporate side. You may be aware of an apprenticeship program that Siemens has in Charlotte. We have 3 high school students who are participating in that. One of them is a young woman named Hope, and her story's been told countless times by legislators, by education and training folks. She was profiled in the DCA airport advertisements we did, and so she's really just become a story about not only success for females in STEM middle skill occupations, but success stories for apprenticeships, expanding them into different and new areas. She intentionally chose that program instead of a 4-year path, knowing that she could eventually move forward in that it wasn't a ceiling for her, but it was a floor. And so we've seen that storytelling element really have an impact on drawing others to that conversation, and that's one of the goals we hope we'll be able to reach through some of this profiling work that we plan to do.
Elsa and Abby, anything to add?
So we don't have a specific gender lens. I think that we have been looking at inequities. When you think about youth and young adults who are unemployed, we've been looking at different inequities. We are particularly focused on sort of racial and ethnic disparities, but I think also when you start to parse that data, you start to see, like, for example, African American young men and Latinas who are particularly struggling in the labor market. And so while we didn't set out to say we're interested in women, I think that Latinas are emerging, and that would be something we would hope to learn. And I think similar, to what you're saying, Crystal, I think part of what needs to be done is lifting up what does work as part of this overall nothing works, and starting to change that narrative, but also lifting up for specific groups when there's large disparities around things that do work and things that are successful.
Yeah, I would say our focus has been very similar to that.
I think there's someone has the mic.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I have the mic. So I think, businesses have had such an employer's market that they haven't really focused on the looming retirement of the baby boomers. And I think that's going to create this huge opportunity to say you have to tap all of these potential talent pools. And so if, I'm wondering if there's, as you reach out to employers, if there's a lot of discussion about that and how this can be, your new pipeline, if we get the strategies together now rather than waiting until there's a real crisis.
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly heard a lot of that. I think in general, as the labor market has started to tighten, this conversation about building a talent pipeline and tapping into different pools of talent has only started to. We've heard more and more of it, and I think it's a great opportunity for all of us in the room to think about how we can connect more young people to those jobs. But yes, that's absolutely been something we've heard.
And I would agree. I totally agree with that. And I also think, but I think there's a little bit of, depending on what employer you're talking to, their size, their industry sector, they're feeling that tension more immediately or less immediately. And so sometimes I do think that that's a potential role for philanthropy. In 10 years, we're looking at numbers that look very stark. And if we wait until the quarter in which businesses start to experience that and it really starts to compete with the return to the shareholder, it'll be too late because our young people won't be where they need to be. So I think that's part of the why start now, why make these investments, that we need to get ahead of that, and we need to be making investments that will put us on top of that curve, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. I actually, for some industries, I think they're very aware of this issue. Particularly, I think about utilities. We had the opportunity to have some conversations with the folks from PG&E a few months ago and talk with them about their Power Pathways program that they really pulled together for their talent needs, but because they saw this lingering retirement boom coming. And so I think that it varies industry by industry in terms of their awareness level, but I think some of them are very tuned in, maybe not necessarily at an employer level, but at an industry level about what those upcoming challenges are going to be. But I don't think they've been able to translate that in all cases to start to think about all of these different areas of talent to tap into.
I'm Gail Spock. I'm from a public research university in New Jersey. I've been struck that in this wonderful conference, there has been a mention of education, 2- and 4-year schools, but it's always only been on the side of the academics, of what is being taught. There is a whole other function at all of our colleges in America, which is called the academic support side, which is exactly which builds the character, which has successful programs for youth to get them to do their business when they're in college, which is different than your business when they work. But they have successful programs, and they also are very concerned about diversity and women. And so my question is, how are you working? Are you working with that end of the higher education sector of America, the academic support services end, as opposed to just going to the provost or the dean, which will talk to you about what we're teaching? I think you'll find really good success stories and models that you're looking for there.
So I just say 2 things about that. So one, I think we do at Casey have a pretty deep investment that's emerging that's looking at the sort of wraparound supports that are provided to college students, particularly community college students. It is not in my portfolio. I'm not particularly knowledgeable about it. So I don't want to say anything incorrectly, but it's a fairly significant investment. I think from the young adult employment investment perspective, we think of community colleges as sort of one platform for which some of this could happen, this, connecting to the demand side as well as doing the positive youth development. We're just being a little more agnostic as to we're not focused on community college systems or career and technical ed or industry partnerships. We think that some of this deepening the relationship to businesses and supporting the young person as they develop could happen in any of those platforms.
So we're running out of time. We have one last question back here.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Sharon, and I work at the Department of Veterans Affairs, particularly the Medical Center in New Orleans. And as many of you know, we lost the medical center due to Hurricane Katrina, and we're in the process of rebuilding the hospital now, and we anticipate seeing our first patient at the end of next year. So we plan on doubling our workforce, and currently the workforce is 1,200 people. So there'll be many jobs for young people and anyone who's interested in relocating to New Orleans. My question,
That was a good plug.
that's a plug that I'm putting in there.
And the hospital is quite beautiful.
It's beautiful.
It's
It's
really
a state-of-the-art
beautiful.
campus,
Yeah.
a billion-dollar campus. But my question is, have you all worked with or encouraged organizations to partner with government agencies for jobs? I know for youth, it's easier to get in because there are programs that involves internships, so they can get their foot in the door a whole lot easier than, let's say, someone who's applying for a job.
Sure. I mean, I think, for us, and I assume you're probably talking at the national level, but I'll address that at a few different levels. Just having the experience from my background, I believe it's essential to have public partners in that discussion, especially when we're talking about decision makers and the public workforce system. Those are excellent partnerships that already exist, and it would make no sense to not plug into and utilize those resources and coordinate them, especially at that regional and state level. At the national level, we're going to be doing some work with one of our partners, the National Governors Association, I think they're here, who they're going to be supporting the apprenticeship work with the Department of Labor, and so we're going to be supporting some of that efforts, but staying in touch and in tune with the work that's happening across the federal agencies right now, whether it's the implementation of WIOA or some of the cross partnerships that are happening, looking at career pathways across DOL, I think DBA is part of that as well, HHS. You know, I think it's essential to stay plugged into that and, you know, partner and leverage those opportunities where we can because of the, not only the influence that they have, but they have the ability to connect the dots in a way that many other organizations don't.
I think.
So the only thing I would say is, you know, so I think when you think about particularly local government jobs and think about local government as an employer, in that way, you know, historically those have really been pathways to the middle class, well, particularly like in the District of Columbia and a lot of our major cities, pathways to the middle class for people of color. And I think, you know, we were just talking about this in our board meeting yesterday. It's really important to still, to continue to find those opportunities, but unfortunately because of the changing size of government at the local level, you know, there's fewer and fewer opportunities, and they're happening more as a result of aging out. And I think that, you know, they have their own sort of circular ways of hiring, as somebody who's hired within a government system. And I think one of the more interesting things I've seen is actually the application of the skills-based hiring to some of the work that the mayor's office has done in the Department of Transportation and other places in Albuquerque to say, let's step outside of, you know, our traditional way that we assess whether or not somebody is a good fit for one of these jobs, and let's skill profile the job and let's match a young person based on that skill profile. And so I think some of these things that we're talking about will have applicability, you know, when you think about a public sector as a hiring organization or entity and an employer for them as well. I mean,
yeah. And for our focus has been primarily on sort of working with large private employers, so it hasn't been so much on that side, but I think you're right, there are sort of lessons to be drawn across and some really interesting innovation happening as well.
Crystal, Allison, Abby, thank you. Great
Thank you.
panel. Let's thank them.